Grant Marlowe tapped his champagne glass and smiled at the room like a man who had rehearsed this moment. "To my wife," he said, loud enough that the crystal chandeliers seemed to vibrate, "who has finally found something she's good at." He paused, letting the silence sharpen. Eating. The ballroom laughed. Not nervous laughter. Not uncomfortable laughter. Real laughter, the kind that rolls through a room when the most powerful man in it gives permission to be cruel. Evelyn sat at that table in her 32nd birthday dress and felt the heat climb her throat. She smiled. She had learned to smile through everything. Only one man did not laugh. At the head of the table, Dashiell Whitlock set down his glass and looked at Grant the way a surgeon looks at something that needs to be removed. Then he looked at Evelyn. If you've ever been in a room full of people who chose to laugh at you instead of stand beside you, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels, because what happened next changed everything. The dress had taken her 40 minutes to zip. Not because it didn't fit, it did, barely, with the kind of tension that made her conscious of every breath, but because Evelyn had stood in front of the bathroom mirror for most of those 40 minutes talking herself into attending at all. She had tried the black one first, then the navy, then back to the black, which Grant had once to slimming, which she had understood even then to be a word doing two jobs at once, compliment and reminder. She settled on the burgundy because it was the one he hadn't commented on yet. That felt, at the time, like safety. The Marlowe family birthday celebration was held every year at a private event space on the 43rd floor of a building Grant's grandfather had purchased in 1974. The family kept it for occasions like this occasions, where the point was not to celebrate, but to be seen celebrating, which was a different thing entirely. Flowers had been arranged by someone who charged more per stem than most people spent on groceries. The guest list ran to 112 people, most of whom Evelyn knew by the shape of their handshakes and the things they never quite said directly. She had attended 6 of these now, 6 years of burgundy or black or navy, sitting straight, of laughing at the right moments and going quiet at the others. 6 years of learning the geography of a room so she could position herself where Grant's attention was least likely to land on her like a spotlight finding something unflattering. Tonight she was tired, not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. She stood near the bar and held a glass of sparkling water and watched Grant work the room, with the ease of a man who had never once in his adult life wondered whether he was welcome somewhere. He was 40 years old, 6 feet of tailored confidence, and the room treated him accordingly. People moved toward him the way plants moved toward light, not because they had decided to, but because something in their wiring said that was the correct direction. Evelyn had found that quality magnetic once. She remembered it specifically, the way she had watched him across a dinner party 8 years ago and thought, that man is completely certain of himself, and she had confused certainty for safety. She was still making payments on that confusion. "You look like you're calculating exit routes," said a voice beside her. Evelyn turned. Margot Ellsworth was in her late 50s, had managed the Whitlock estate for 22 years, and had the kind of face that gave nothing away unless she wanted it to. She was not a Marlowe by blood or connection. She worked for Dashiell, Grant's uncle, and attended these events in a professional capacity that Evelyn had never quite been able to define precisely. Margot was simply always there, quiet and observant and impossible to dismiss. "I'm calculating how long until dinner," Evelyn said. Margot looked at her with an expression that said she had heard the real answer beneath the polite one. "Dashiell arrived 20 minutes ago. He's been watching Grant hold court near the windows." Evelyn glanced across the room. She spotted Dashiell Whitlock immediately. It was not difficult. He had one of those presences that reorganized whatever space he occupied. 44 years old, lean silver at his temples, wearing a suit that fit like it had been constructed specifically around his stillness. He was not performing the way Grant performed. He was simply standing there, and the room angled itself accordingly. Evelyn had met him perhaps a dozen times over 6 years. He had always been polite to her in the precise, careful way of someone who saw more than they named. She had never been entirely comfortable around him, which she had assumed was normal. Most people weren't comfortable around Dashiell Whitlock. That discomfort was practically a credential. What she had not expected was that he was watching her now. Not Grant her. She looked away quickly and returned her attention to her sparkling water. Grant's voice rose above the ambient noise of the room as he gathered the attention of the nearest cluster of guests. The story of how they'd met she had heard him tell it at least 30 times, and it changed slightly each retelling, the version of Evelyn in the story growing incrementally more helpless and incrementally funnier, while the version of Grant grew incrementally more patient and indulgent. The guests laughed in the places they were supposed to laugh. Evelyn smiled. She had learned that the smile was load-bearing. Without it, the story became something different. The dinner seated 112 people along tables, dressed in white linen and silver. Evelyn sat 4 seats from Grant, which was the arrangement his mother preferred, close enough to demonstrate union, far enough to allow Grant freedom of conversation without the constraint of a wife, requiring attention. She ate slowly and spoke when spoken to, and made the kind of small, safe remarks that left no impression and caused no friction. She had become very good at not leaving an impression. Across the table and 3 seats down, she was aware of Dashiell eating with the same measured composure he brought to everything. He had spoken twice during dinner, once to correct a factual error, a conversation about shipping routes, once to ask a question about the renovation of the family's Connecticut property. Both times his voice was calm and deliberate and landed with the weight of someone who had never in his life felt the need to raise it. She caught herself watching him for a moment longer than was casual. He did not look back. He was at that moment watching Grant. Grant stood when the dessert plates arrived, which was the signal Evelyn had learned to dread. The standing meant a speech, and the speech meant she would need to sustain the smile for an extended period in a public setting. She adjusted her posture. She settled her expression. "Ladies and gentlemen," Grant said, and the room quieted for him the way rooms always quieted for Grant. 32 years ago tonight, the most interesting thing that ever happened to me was born. He paused for the right kind of laughter which arrived on schedule. Obviously, I'm talking about myself. The room laughed again. Evelyn smiled. But in all seriousness, Grant continued, I want to take a moment to acknowledge my wife, who is here tonight looking. He tilted his head slightly, examining her across the table with an expression of theatrical consideration. Well, Evelyn, you have certainly found something you're good at. Another pause. Perfectly timed. Eating. The laughter was immediate. Not all of it. There were faces in the room that flickered, that almost caught, that nearly chose something else. But the dominant sound was laughter, and it was real laughter. The unguarded kind that happens was every person of standing gives everyone else permission to find something funny that they might otherwise have hesitated over. Evelyn smiled. She had perfected it so completely that she could hold it through almost anything. The heat in her throat, the specific quality of 100 voices choosing to laugh at her body in a room full of food, she had been careful about all evening. The way Grant looked at her while the room laughed, with the small, satisfied expression of a man who had landed exactly the blow he had aimed for. She smiled. At the head of the table, a chair moved. Dashiell Whitlock rose quietly, set his napkin beside his plate, and left the room without a word. He did not excuse himself loudly. He simply stood and walked out, and the gap where his laughter should have been was the loudest thing in the room, even though almost no one noticed it. Evelyn noticed. She held the smile until Grant sat back down, and the conversation redistributed itself, and people stopped looking at her. Then she excused herself to use the restroom, and instead walked to the far end of the hallway and stood beside a window, overlooking the city with her forehead, almost touching the cold glass, and her eyes refusing to cooperate. She would not cry here. She had a rule about that. The rule had been tested often enough that she was experienced in holding the line. She heard footsteps and straightened immediately. A sound like green wood splitting, which was reflex, a survival adjustment she had developed somewhere in the 3rd year of her marriage. When she had understood that appearing vulnerable in front of Grant's family was a cost she couldn't afford. It was Margot. The older woman stopped a few feet away and looked at Evelyn with an expression that contained no pity, which was the only thing Evelyn felt she could have stood at that moment. Pity would have broken the rule. He does that, Margot said. Not a question. Evelyn said nothing. You've been managing this for a while. I'm fine, Evelyn said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, which was the one thing still working correctly. Margot reached into the small clutch she carried and produced a business card. Plain, heavy cardstock, no embellishment. A name. A phone number. An address on Park Avenue. She held it out without comment. Evelyn took it before she understood why. Dashiell Whitlock. Whitlock Meridian Holdings. He asked me to give you that, Margot said. Not tonight specifically. He asked me to give it to you the next time you looked like you needed somewhere to be. Evelyn stared at the card. He left the dinner, she said. He did, because he didn't explain himself. He rarely does. Margot adjusted her wrap. He did say one thing before he left. He said that a room full of people laughing at the wrong thing is a room that's told you everything you need to know. Evelyn looked down at the card in her hand. Behind her, faint music drifted from the ballroom. In there, her husband was telling another story. The room was laughing at all the right places. Grant never came looking for her. She stood at that window for another 14 minutes. She counted. He never came. 3 days later, she walked into the lobby of a building on Park Avenue at 9:40 in the morning, carrying Dashiell's card in her coat pocket and a version of herself she was still trying to locate. She had told herself this was professional curiosity, that she was simply following up on what might be a business contact, that this had nothing to do with burgundy dresses or birthday dinners or the specific quality of 100 people laughing. The lobby was all dark marble and clean lines, staffed by people who projected the particular confidence of those accustomed to proximity to power. The receptionist looked up at Evelyn with the polite, assessing expression of someone trained to make that evaluation quickly and invisibly. Evelyn Marlowe. She hesitated. Appointment felt presumptuous. She hadn't called ahead. I have a card for Mr. Whitlock. The receptionist looked at the card, picked up a phone, spoke briefly, and nodded. 22nd floor. His assistant will meet you. She had expected to wait. She had constructed an entire internal narrative around waiting the waiting room, the 15 minutes of sitting with her coat in her lap, the opportunity to reconsider and leave before any commitment was made. She had been prepared for that kind of friction. What she was not prepared for was the elevator opening directly into a reception area where a young man in a precisely fitted jacket was already standing, already moving toward her, already saying Mrs. Marlowe, this way, as if her arrival had been expected, and the 22nd floor had simply been paused until she got there. Dashiell's office was not what she expected, which she recognized immediately as a failure of imagination on her part. She had expected something that announced itself: heavy furniture, art chosen to signal importance, the accumulated visual vocabulary of power. What she found instead was a room of spare, functional sophistication, ordered in the way of someone who thought about things clearly, and required their environment to match. A desk with nothing on it except a laptop and a single folder. Windows that overlooked the city without apology. Dashiell stood when she entered. Mrs. Marlowe. Evelyn, she said. And then, because she wasn't sure of the register of this conversation yet, she added, I should have called. You're here, he said, which landed not as a reproach but as a statement of simple fact, the kind that dismissed the need for apology. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Sit. She sat. He sat. For a moment neither of them spoke, and she was aware that she was in the strange territory of a silence that didn't feel hostile, that felt, actually, like someone deciding how to begin with honesty rather than convenience. I'll be direct, he said. Please, she said, which came out with more feeling than she intended. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Before you married Grant, you were an executive coordinator at Hargrove Financial. You managed a team of 11 people, oversaw international scheduling for 6 senior partners, and were cited in an internal review as the primary reason a 2018 acquisition negotiation didn't collapse in the 3rd week. Evelyn said nothing. You left that position in early 2019, Dashiell continued. Grant's preference. She looked at him. You researched me. I research people I consider employing. You're considering employing me? I'm offering you a position as my executive secretary, he said. This is not a courtesy arrangement. I have a specific requirement for someone with institutional memory of complex organizational systems, the composure to operate in high-pressure environments, and the judgment to know what I need before I have articulated it. Based on what I know of your professional record, you meet those requirements. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. The clarity of it was almost disorienting, the absence of softening, of hedging, of the usual performance of concern that was really a different kind of management. Grant's your nephew, she said. He is. This could complicate things. Most useful arrangements are complicated, Dashiell said. That doesn't concern me. What concerns me is whether you can do the work. She looked at him directly for the first time since entering the office. I can do the work, she said. He nodded once, the way someone nods when they have received the answer they were measuring for. Then we'll begin Monday, she told Grant that evening. He was at the kitchen island with a glass of scotch and his aunt's laptop when she came in and stood across from him and said she had taken a position with Whitlock Meridian Holdings, effective Monday. Grant's expression went through 3 distinct phases in the space of 4 seconds. First, confusion, because this did not fit any existing pattern. Second, recalibration, the visible process of determining what this meant for him. Third, the settled mask of someone deciding how to be amused by something that had actually alarmed them. Dashiell's company, he said. Yes, as what? Executive secretary. Grant picked up his glass and looked at it briefly, a gesture she recognized as buying time. Evelyn. Dashiell runs a legitimate corporation on top of. He stopped, adjusted. His operation isn't exactly a standard office environment. I'm aware of your uncle's reputation, she said. She kept her voice even. She had rehearsed this part in the car. He's offering me a professional position in a legitimate company. I reviewed the public filings. You reviewed the public. Grant made a sound that was adjacent to a laugh. You've been at home for 3 years. You want to jump into managing Dashiell's schedule? She said. Grant set his glass down. This is because of the other night. His tone shifted, not softer, but more careful, the way he got when he needed her to perform something specific. Evelyn, that was a joke. You know how I am at these things. She looked at him. I know exactly how you are at these things, she said. She walked out of the kitchen. Behind her, he said nothing. She had counted on him saying nothing. The first 2 weeks at Whitlock Meridian were the hardest she had worked in 3 years, and she had not realized it until she was inside the effort how much she had missed the specific exhaustion of work that required everything from her. Dashiell's organizational structure was complex in the way of something built by someone who trusted very few people and had compensated by constructing systems that could operate with minimal dependence on any single variable. There were overlapping schedules, simultaneous time zones, standing protocols for communication that existed in no written document and had to be inferred from observation. His previous executive secretary had left for a position in Hong Kong, and the interim arrangement had produced 3 months of accumulated disorder beneath a surface that looked controlled. Evelyn spent the first week reading everything, every meeting record, every travel log, every communication pattern she could access. She made notes in the small leather notebook she had carried since her time at Hargrove and said almost nothing, which she suspected was being measured. On the 8th day, she walked into Dashiell's office at 7:52 in the morning and placed a single document on his desk. He looked up. Your Thursday meeting in Geneva conflicts with the customs clearance window for the Rotterdam shipment, she said. The Geneva meeting can move to Wednesday evening without disrupting any existing commitment. The Rotterdam timeline cannot move without a financial penalty. I've drafted the rescheduling communications, if you want to review them, before they go out. Dashiell looked at the document. He looked at her. Send them, he said. She nodded and left the office. That afternoon, his assistant found her at her desk and said that Mr. Whitlock had asked her to be included in Thursday's executive briefing going forward. It was the first time in 3 years that a professional accomplishment had felt like something that belonged to her. She sat with that for a moment. Then she opened the next file. Grant noticed before she expected him to. She had assumed he would not pay close enough attention, that her changed schedule and gradually adjusted posture would register somewhere in his peripheral awareness as a minor irritant, something to address when convenient, something that did not rise to the level of real concern. She had underestimated him in this specific direction, which she acknowledged to herself as fair. She had spent years underestimating her own capacity to change, so perhaps the error was systemic. It was a Tuesday evening in the 4th week when he said, without preamble, that she seemed different. She was at the dining table with her laptop and the briefing notes for a Friday meeting. He had come in like green wood splitting. He had come in from whatever he'd been doing and stood in the doorway with the glass in his hand and looked at her with the expression she had learned to read as the preliminary to something. "Different how?" she said. She didn't look up. "You don't do that anymore," he said. "Do what? Apologize for being in the way." She looked up then. He was watching her with something she could not immediately name. It wasn't hostility yet. It was the look of someone whose map had stopped matching the territory and hadn't yet decided whether to update the map or dispute the territory. "I'm not in the way," she said. He made a small sound and left the doorway. She returned to the briefing notes, but her hands were not entirely steady, and she stayed aware of the fact that his attention still had a physical effect on her, that 3 years of erosion did not reverse in 4 weeks. That rebuilding was not a clean progression, but a thing that went forward and backward and sideways and required her to hold the line on days when holding it cost more than she had available. She held it. She went back to the notes. The Friday meeting went well. The Friday meeting ran 40 minutes over schedule, which Evelyn had anticipated and prepared for, and the fact that she had prepared for it was the thing that mattered. She had flagged it to Dashiell on Thursday afternoon, a single line in her daily briefing. Friday's logistics review will run long. Reeves always disputes the Rotterdam numbers before accepting them. Billed in 40 minutes. He had read it, said nothing. And the next morning she watched him settle into the extended meeting with the patience of someone who had arrived already knowing the shape of the afternoon. When Reeves finally conceded the Rotterdam numbers at the 43rd minute, Dashiell glanced across the table at Evelyn with an expression that contained precisely nothing visible and somehow communicated everything. She had driven home that evening with her hands loose on the steering wheel and something in her chest that she recognized, after a moment, as satisfaction. Not happiness. Happiness was a larger thing, and she was not ready to claim it yet. But satisfaction, the specific kind that comes from doing something difficult correctly, and having that correctness acknowledged by someone whose acknowledgement means something. She had not felt it in 3 years. She parked in the building garage and sat in the car for 2 minutes before going upstairs. Not because she was avoiding anything, she told herself that specifically, but because she needed those 2 minutes to put herself back in the correct configuration. The woman who walked into Whitlock Meridian at 7:45 in the morning and the woman who walked into the apartment she shared with Grant Marlowe in the evening were not in conflict exactly, but they required different stances, and the transition had a cost. She had started thinking of it as changing into armor. Grant was in the living room when she came in, not reading, not working, just sitting in the chair by the window with a glass of scotch, and the expression of someone who had been waiting long enough that the waiting had become its own statement. "It's 7:30, he said. The meeting ran over. She set her bag down by the entryway console. "I texted. You did." He turned the glass slowly in his hand. "Dashiell know his staff is working past 7 on a Friday?" "I'm not staff," she said. "I'm his executive secretary." "That's different." "Is it?" "Yes." She moved toward the kitchen. "Have you eaten?" "I ordered something earlier." A pause. "Since apparently we're not doing dinners anymore." She stopped at the kitchen doorway, turned to look at him. He was watching her with the particular expression she had named, in her own private vocabulary. The accounting looked the one that meant he was tallying things, adding up perceived debts and deficits, constructing the case that would be presented when it suited him. "I told you Monday through Friday I'd be home between 6:30 and 7:30, depending on the day," she said. "Today was a 7:30 day." "You told me," he said. "Right. You've been doing a lot of telling lately." She looked at him. "As opposed to what?" she said. He didn't answer immediately. He took a drink, set the glass down on the side table with a small, deliberate sound. "You've been different," he said. "I mentioned it before." "You did. I'm mentioning it again. I heard you both times, Grant." She went into the kitchen. She was not, but she needed the physical distance of another room, the counter between her and that conversation, the ordinary activity of filling a glass of water so her hands had something to do. She stood at the sink and listened to the ambient sounds of the apartment and breathed. He appeared in the kitchen doorway 30 seconds later. "I'm not criticizing the job," he said, which was the way he opened things when he needed to appear reasonable before becoming unreasonable. "I think it's good for you. Getting out. Having structure." She drank her water. "But Dashiell's operation isn't Evelyn. You understand what that company is built on. Not the shipping, not the real estate. I work in executive operations," she said. "I manage his schedule and coordinate his business meetings and prevent logistical disasters. That's what I do. You're very certain about that." "I'm certain about what I do every day, yes." Grant crossed his arms. It was a small physical shift that she had learned to read. Accurately, it meant he had moved from fishing to something more deliberate. "He gave you his private card. At our family dinner. Through Margot. Without mentioning it to me. He offered me an opportunity. He offered my wife an opportunity. Without asking me." She set the glass down on the counter, turned to face him fully. "Grant, you don't ask me before you do things." A silence. "That's different," he said. "Tell me how." He looked at her with the accounting expression, plus something new, something that was almost, she thought, the beginning of actual feeling, the kind that surfaces when a person realizes their opponent has stopped performing and is simply standing there being correct. It was uncomfortable for him. She could see that. She was not without sympathy for the discomfort. But she was done managing it for him. "You changed your hair," he said. She almost laughed. It was such a sudden redirect and so specific that it landed like a confession. She had trimmed it not dramatically, not a statement, just cleaned up the ends and pushed it back from her face in a way that she liked. She had done it on a Wednesday afternoon without thinking of it as anything except maintenance. "Yes," she said. "It looks fine," he said, which meant he did not like it, or more precisely, that he had not been consulted. "Thank you," she said, which meant she didn't need him to like it. He went back to the living room. She stood in the kitchen alone and finished her water, and noticed that her hands were completely steady. The charity gala was in early November, and Evelyn had been coordinating the Whitlock Meridian presence for 6 weeks. It was not a simple coordination. Dashiell used these events the way most people used boardrooms, which was to say they were professional operations wrapped in social form. And the execution required the same level of preparation as any major meeting. 14 attendees from WMH, 3 separate dinner table arrangements that required strategic placement, a sequence of conversations that needed to happen in a specific order, and a potential complication in the form of a senior partner from a Brussels firm who had a history of cornering people at bars and asking questions he should have been asking in writing. Evelyn had mapped all of it. She wore emerald green. She had seen the dress 3 weeks before the event and bought it on the same afternoon without trying it on, which was the first time she had purchased clothing that way in years. Grant's voice had been in her head in the dressing room of 1,000 previous shopping trips, specific and well-practiced, cataloging the architecture of her body in the language of concern. "You'd want something with more structure there. That cut doesn't do you any favors. Are you sure about that color?" She had learned to hear it even when he wasn't present, which she understood was the point. The most efficient version of control required no ongoing maintenance. In the 3-way mirror of her bedroom, she looked at herself in the emerald dress and waited for the voice. It did not come. What came instead was a simpler, quieter recognition. She looked like herself. Not a corrected or improved or strategically assembled version of herself. Just herself in a color she liked, in a room where no one was grading the outcome. She zipped it herself. Grant saw her in the lobby of the event space, and his expression went through the same 3-phase calculation she had learned to read. Confusion, recalibration, settled amusement. "That's a choice," he said. "Yes," she said. "I made it." He said nothing further on that subject. inside the Xala, she worked. That was the most accurate description. It was work. In the same way that the Friday meeting and the Rotterdam problem and the Geneva rescheduling were work. She moved through the room with the executive briefing memorized, knew which conversations needed to happen before 9 o'clock and which could wait, intercepted the Brussels partner at the bar with the kind of smooth professional redirect that left him feeling complimented rather than managed, and was standing beside Dashiell's table when a potential problem emerged at 8:47 in the form of an urgent call from the Rotterdam terminal supervisor indicating a documentation error that, if unresolved before morning, would cost the company somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000 in penalties. She stepped away from the table. She called the terminal directly. She spent 11 minutes on the phone with 2 different supervisors and 1 administrative contact at the customs office, and by 8:58 she had located the original documentation, identified the clerical error, confirmed the correction process, and extracted a written commitment that the updated filing would be submitted before midnight. She walked back to the table and set a brief handwritten note in front of Dashiell, 3 lines, the problem, the solution, the timeline, and returned to her position. He read it, he looked up. He said quietly, "Good work." 2 words. She was aware that from Dashiell Whitlock, they constitute something closer to a standing ovation, and she was further aware that she should not be as moved by them as she was. And she was also aware that the appropriate response to both of those awarenesses was to accept the feeling and continue doing her job. She continued doing her job. It was near the end of the evening when Grant appeared. He had been at the same event several Marlowe family members attended, and she had seen him across the Suisse and executed a professional assessment of the sight lines that allowed her to remain in useful positions without manufactured proximity. She was not avoiding him. She was prioritizing. He found her in conversation with 2 senior executives from a Munich logistics firm. The conversation was going well. She had been talking about the Rotterdam restructuring with the specific conversational fluency of someone who had spent 6 weeks living inside its details, and the Munich executives were engaged in the way of people who had encountered someone unexpectedly worth talking to. Grant inserted himself. It was not aggressive. He was too experienced a social operator for aggression in a room like this. He stepped in with the warm familiarity of a husband joining his wife's conversation, and the Munich executives stepped back slightly to accommodate him, which was the natural social gravity of an insertion executed correctly. "My wife is clearly making herself indispensable," he said, with the tone of generous pride, and the Munich executives smiled. "She's had a remarkable run. Lucky for her, the family connection opened the right door." Some of the executives looked at Evelyn. She was aware of her own face very specifically at that moment, of the effort required to keep it neutral, of the particular kind of humiliation that comes packaged in praise, of the 6 weeks of work that had just been attributed to a door she hadn't needed anyone to open for her. A voice arrived, calm and unhurried, from 2 feet to her left. Evelyn's professional record preceded any connection to this organization by approximately 7 years, Dashiell said. He had appeared without announcement, which she had observed was characteristic of him. He simply arrived in places, as if the space had arranged itself around his presence rather than the other way around. The position she holds required specific qualifications. She met them. Grant's expression performed a rapid recalibration. "Of course. I was just joking," Dashiell said. "Yes." He looked at Grant with the expression of someone reading a very short document. Jokes repeated often enough become character. The Munich executives found something to look at in the middle distance. Grant laughed. It was not his best laugh. There was something compressed in it, something that indicated the laugh was performing work it was not designed for. "Fair enough," he said, and redirected himself toward the bar with the smooth efficiency of a man who had extracted himself from many uncomfortable moments. Evelyn looked at Dashiell. He was already turning back toward the Munich executives with a question about their southern hub expansion, and the conversation continued, and the evening continued. Evelyn stood there for a moment with the specific of someone who has been in a car accident that lasted half a second and is still processing whether they're injured. She was not injured. That was the remarkable part. She was angry, which was different, and underneath the anger something she hadn't recognized in herself for a long time, which was the sense that she had the right to be. Grant didn't bring it up until the following morning. She was at the kitchen table with coffee and her laptop, running through the week's schedule, when he came in with the expression that meant the accounting was complete and the invoice was ready. "Last night," he said. "Yes," she said without looking up. Dashiell had no reason to step in like that. He was correcting a factual inaccuracy. He was correcting me, in front of colleagues. She looked up. "You told 2 Munich executives that my career exists because of family connections." In front of those same colleagues. I was being conversational. "You were diminishing 6 weeks of work in one sentence." Grant sat down, across from her. She noticed he hadn't brought coffee. He had come straight from the bedroom because this conversation had been assembling itself in his head since last night, and the coffee would have been an interruption. He pressed both hands flat on the table. "I'm going to tell you what I actually think," he said, "which is that Dashiell has a reason for taking this interest in you, and it has nothing to do with your executive skills." She looked at him steadily. "Say what you mean. You're not naive, Evelyn. Say it clearly, Grant. If you're going to accuse me of something, do it in actual words." His jaw moved. He was not, she thought, entirely wrong, that there was something between her and Dashiell, a kern of recognition, a quality of attention that was different from professional courtesy. But she also knew it had not been acted on, that Dashiell had maintained a boundary she had not been required to name because it had never been tested. She knew the difference between a feeling and a fact, and she knew which one her husband was building a case on. "I'm not accusing you of anything," Grant said. "I'm telling you that my uncle is not a simple man with simple motives." "No," she said. "He's not. He's a complicated man who has never once made me feel worthless, which puts him ahead of most people I know." The silence after that was the specific quality of silence that follows a sentence that cannot be unsaid. Grant stood. He picked up the coffee he hadn't brought. He left the kitchen. Evelyn returned to the schedule. Her hands were not steady this time. She acknowledged that, let it be true for 30 seconds, and then made them steady again through the effort of will that she had been building for 8 weeks. She sent Dashiell the week's briefing at 8:15. He responded at 8:17, Thursday's board prep. "Your analysis on the Antwerp contract would be useful." She opened the Antwerp file and started reading. The Antwerp contract analysis took her 2 days. Not because the contract was opaque, it was, actually, less well concealed than whoever had structured it seemed to believe, but because she approached it with the same methodology she had used at Hargrove. She read everything attached to everything, traced every reference to its source document, and mapped the transaction structure before she formed a single opinion about what it meant. What it meant by the time she had mapped it was not straightforward. She brought her findings to Dashiell on Wednesday afternoon. Not in a formal meeting. She requested 15 minutes, and he gave her 20, which was its own kind of signal, and she laid the documents across his desk in a sequence that told the story in the order it needed to be told. She pointed to 3 inflated consulting invoices. She pointed to the name on the consultant of record. She said, "I don't know if you're aware of this." Dashiell looked at the documents for a long time. His face did not change. This was not the stillness of someone suppressing reaction. She had learned to read him well enough to know the difference it was, the stillness of someone who was thinking clearly and did not require external signs to confirm the process. "How long did it take you to find this?" he said. 2 days. "Our internal audit team had this contract for 6 months." She said nothing. He looked up from the documents. At her. The quality of his attention in that moment was the most fully present she had ever felt from another person, which was disquieting in the way of things that are more than you've prepared for. "You understand what this means," he said. She understood exactly what it meant. The name on the consultant of record was not a stranger. It was a Marlowe. She had not said this aloud yet. She waited. Dashiell said quietly, "Grant." "Yes," she said. He looked back at the documents. He was quiet for long enough that she began to understand. This was not a development that had entirely surprised him. It had confirmed something he had suspected, which was different. A sound like green wood splitting, and the difference meant the investigation had already been moving beneath the surface of the organization before she had handed him the evidence. "You'll want these copies," he said, "and you'll want to decide whether you're the person who tells him what you found." She looked at him. "Why would I tell him?" "Because you're still his wife," Dashiell said. "Not as a judgment, as a fact. And because you found it, which means if this goes further, you'll be asked about the sequence of events. I want you to know that sequence before it matters." She stood in that office with the Antwerp documents in her hands and felt the entire architecture of her life rearrange itself around a single truth. Her husband had been stealing from his uncle's company. Had concealed it under a consulting arrangement, thin enough that she had found it in 2 days, and she was standing in the office of the man he had stolen from, who was looking at her with the expression of someone deciding how much rope to give a situation before he pulled it. "What are you going to do?" she said. "My job," Dashiell said. "Correctly. Which means I'm not going to make this disappear." He looked at her one more time, and the look contained something she had no word for. Something between acknowledgement and warning, and the particular sorrow of a man who has seen the consequences of certain decisions, long before the people making those decisions have. "Go home, Evelyn," he said. "Think about what you want the next chapter of your life to look like." She gathered the documents. She walked to the elevator. She stood in the lobby of Whitlock Meridian Holdings and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that she had crossed something, not a line she had chosen, but a threshold that the accumulation of 8 weeks and 6 years and 1 birthday dinner and 1 emerald dress had been building toward without her permission. There was no going back to the woman who had zipped herself into burgundy and held a smile through a ballroom full of laughter. That woman was gone. The question now was what came next, and she did not yet know the answer, and the not knowing was the most honest thing she had felt in years. She drove home with the documents in her bag, and Grant's name in her chest like a stone she had swallowed. The traffic on the bridge was stop and start, the kind that gives a person too much time to think, and Evelyn used that time not to plan anything. She was not ready to plan, but to go back through the sequence and make sure she had not made an error. That was her instinct when facing something she didn't want to be true. She went back to the beginning and checked her work, because occasionally the error was in the reading and not in the fact, and an error was better than the alternative. There was no error. She had pulled the original invoices, the payment records, the consultant registration documents. She had done splitting. She had traced the LLC that held the consulting arrangement to a registered address in Delaware that connected through 2 layers of corporate paperwork to a holding company that Grant had established in 2017 before they were married, which meant it had been built before he ever had access to WMH meeting schedules and internal contract structures, which meant, and this was the part she kept returning to, the part that kept not making sense until it made a different and worse kind of sense. He had positioned it in advance. Not opportunistically, deliberately. The traffic moved. She moved with it. She had been inside his marriage for 6 years, not knowing that she was also inside his operation, that her proximity to the Whitlock family name had value to him beyond the social architecture she had always vaguely understood she provided. She thought about the dinners she had attended, the names she had dropped without knowing she was dropping them, the offhand mentions of Dashiell's travel schedule and the Geneva meetings and the Rotterdam restructuring that she had made to Grant in the evenings, over dinner, the way you talked to your spouse about your workday. She thought about how he had asked, specifically and with genuine seeming interest, about the Antwerp contract 3 weeks ago. She had told him it was in review. The traffic opened up. She accelerated without noticing. Grant was not home when she arrived, which was a temporary grace she did not waste. She went to her home office, the room Grant called the spare room, and she had been quietly reclaiming over the past 2 months, bringing her files home, reconstructing the organizational system she had once maintained at Hargrove, and she sat at the desk and she read everything again. Not because she expected to find a different answer, because she needed to know the full shape of it before she was in the same room with him. He came in at 8:43. She heard the front door, the sound of keys on the entry console, his footsteps, the specific rhythm of them, which told her he was in a certain mood, the one that moved through the apartment like it owned the square footage. She heard the refrigerator open, ice in a glass, the particular sequence of his evening unwinding. She walked out of the home office. He was in the kitchen, scotch already poured, jacket still on. He looked up when she came in, and his expression did the small calibration it always did, reading her face for information, determining which posture the evening required. She set 3 documents on the island between them. Not all of them. 3. The ones that told the story most economically. The inflated invoice, the LLC registration, the payment record with his account number 3 layers but present, traceable, sitting there in the banking chain like a fingerprint he had not thought to clean. He looked at them. He picked up his glass and looked at them over the rim. "Where did you get these?" he said. "From the Antwerp contract file," she said. "I was asked to analyze it." "By yes." He set the glass down. He was not performing anything now. She could see the performance machinery go quiet, see the man beneath the machinery making rapid adjustments to a situation that had just changed shape. He picked up the invoice. He looked at it for a specific number of seconds. He set it back down. "This is out of context," he said. "Tell me the context." "There are consulting arrangements throughout WMH that have been structured this way for years." "This isn't Evelyn. This is a documentation issue. A formatting problem. The LLC registration is in your name," she said. "The account it connects to received $460,000 over 18 months from WMH operational funds. That's not a formatting problem." A silence. "Did you give these to Dashiell?" he said. "I found them for Dashiell," she said. "That's what he asked me to do." Something moved across Grant's face that she had not seen before, or perhaps had seen in fragments and only now was seeing assembled. It was not anger. Anger, she knew well, had learned its topography over 6 years. This was something colder and more deliberate, expression of a man running calculations about a situation he had assumed was under control and discovering it was not. "You need to understand something," he said. His voice had dropped in register, smoothed out the way it got when he was managing the situation rather than reacting to it. "What you found the way you found it, the fact that you brought it to him that creates a problem." "For you," she said. "For both of us, you're still my wife. Anything you provide in connection with an investigation of my finances becomes part of your liability, too. Did you know that?" She looked at him. "I'm not going to be threatened," she said. "I'm not threatening you. I'm informing you." He moved around the island. Not toward her, he stopped at the far end, but the movement itself was a pressure, the use of physical space as punctuation. "You work for Dashiell. You have access to internal documents. If this goes further, they will ask, when you found this, how long you had it, whether you took copies home. And the answer to all 3 of those questions puts you in a position I would not wish on you." She stood completely still. "You're asking me to be quiet," she said. "I'm asking you to be smart. Those are 2 different things," she said. "Though you've been confusing them for a long time." His jaw set. He came around the island then, fully, stopping 4 feet from her close enough for the conversation to become something other than conversational, far enough that she could breathe. 6 years, he said. 6 years of support, of positioning, of every door that's been opened for you because of this family's name. And you're going to hand documents to my uncle because you found a consulting arrangement you don't fully understand. "I understand it completely," she said. "That's the problem. Evelyn," his voice dropped further, "think about what you're doing. Think about where you'll go if this marriage ends. Think about what you'll have." She had thought about it. A sound like green wood splitting. She had thought about it in the car on the bridge, and in the home office, and in the 14 minutes at the window after her birthday dinner, and in every morning of the past 8 weeks when she had driven to Park Avenue and walked into a building, where someone looked at her and saw not a liability but a resource. "I'll have my work," she said. "I'll have myself, and I'll have the knowledge that I didn't cover for something illegal because I was afraid of being inconvenienced." Grant stared at her. "You've changed," he said, and this time it wasn't an observation. It was an indictment. "Yes," she said. She walked back to the home office. She closed the door. She desk and waited for the sound of him leaving the kitchen, which came after 4 minutes of nothing. And then she put her face in her hands for 30 seconds, not crying, just containing the pressure of everything pressing outward. And then she sat up and opened her laptop and sent Dashiell a message confirming that the documents were complete and she was available for the board briefing Thursday morning. She pressed send. She did not take it back. Thursday arrived with the weight of something that has been building for a long time and has finally run out of space to continue building. Dashiell had arranged the board meeting under the cover of the quarterly leadership review, which was a standing event on the WMH calendar and attracted no particular attention from outside observers. The Whitlock estate in Westchester was used for these quarterly gatherings. Evelyn had coordinated the logistics herself, which now struck her as having a dark procedural irony to it. She drove up with a folder of printed documents and a stomach that had rejected breakfast, and she arrived at the estate at 9:15 to find Margot at the front entrance, which was unusual. Margot managed the estate. She did not stand at the door. "He's already inside," Margot said. Evelyn understood immediately. Grant arrived at 8:50. Margot's expression was the closed, careful kind. "He knows about the board meeting." "How?" "Unknown." Evelyn took a breath, let it out slowly. "Who's in the room?" 7 board members, Dashiell's legal counsel, the internal audit team, and now Grant. Margot paused. He brought his own attorney. Evelyn stood on the stone steps of the Whitlock estate and recalibrated. The morning she had planned the structured presentation of the audit findings, the measured legal process, the clean institutional machinery of consequence had been interrupted before it began. Grant had not waited. He had come here to get ahead of the story. She went inside. The boardroom was at the end of the east corridor, a long room with windows on one side and the particular quality of expensive quiet that comes from rooms where significant things have been decided. Evelyn had been in this room twice before for the quarterly reviews she had coordinated. She knew the chairs and the table and the temperature and the way the light fell across the lawn in late morning. She did not know the particular configuration she found when she entered. Grant was at the far end of the table. He had his jacket on and his attorney beside him, and his expression arranged in the version she recognized as his formal performance, controlled, reasonable, projecting the patient sorrow of a man being treated unjustly. Beside him, the attorney, a compact, precise woman named Halverson, who Evelyn recognized from various Marlowe family legal proceedings, had a portfolio open and a legal pad at the ready. Dashiell was at the head of the table. He looked at Evelyn when she came in and gave her a single nod, the kind that meant, "Sit down, we're beginning." And she found her chair at the side of the table and settled into it with her folder in front of her, and her face doing exactly what she needed it to do, which was nothing. Grant did not look at her. The audit team led a man named Pressman, who wore the expression of someone who had delivered bad news professionally for 30 years and had made peace with the job, began the presentation at 9:32. He was methodical. He moved through the documentation in sequence, the consulting structure, the LLC trail, the payment records, the timeline of disbursements. He presented it without editorializing, which was its own kind of devastating, because the facts required no embellishment, and the room understood this. At the 17-minute mark, Grant's attorney raised her hand. "If I may," Halverson said, with the composed courtesy of someone who is very good at what she does. "Before this continues, my client would like to address the characterization of these arrangements directly." Dashiell said, "He'll have the opportunity." Halverson nodded. "Then I'd also like to raise, at this juncture, a question about the integrity of the audit process, specifically the involvement of Mrs. Marlowe in sourcing and presenting documentation." She looked directly at Evelyn. "Mrs. Marlowe has a personal and financial interest in the outcome of her husband's employment position within this organization. The documents she produced were located and curated by an individual with a clear conflict of interest, and any findings derived from those documents may be subject to challenge on that basis." The room went quiet in a particular way. Evelyn felt it, the sudden directional shift, the way the argument had pivoted from Grant's misconduct to her credibility and the time it takes a trained attorney to finish a paragraph. She understood it immediately. This was the plan. This was why Grant had come at 8:50. Not to defend himself against the audit, but to turn the audit into an attack on the person who had found it. She looked at Dashiell. His expression had not changed. Pressman, to his credit, did not look up from his documents. The LLC registration and payment records were sourced from WMH's own internal financial system, he said. Mrs. Marlowe identified the discrepancy. The documentation itself comes from our own records, identified through access granted to her by the principal respondent's family member, Halverson said, which creates a structural problem for the evidentiary chain. Grant was looking at Evelyn now. She met his eyes. His expression was the one she had seen in the kitchen on Wednesday night. Not the accounting look, not the management look, but the other one, the one she had glimpsed, in fragments, and now saw whole. It was the look of a man who had decided at some point before this morning that she was an obstacle rather than a person, and that obstacles were things you removed. She had loved him. She had loved the version of him she believed existed somewhere beneath the management and the diminishment. She had spent years looking for that version, the way you look for something in a room that's been thoroughly cleaned of the thing you need methodically at first, then desperately, then with the particular hollow feeling of someone who finally accepts that the thing was never there. That feeling was in her now, clean, terrible, clarifying. She opened her folder. "If I may," she said, and her voice came out level, which cost her something she did not have a name for. Halverson turned. The documentation trail I followed began with the discrepancy I found in the Antwerp contract during my standard analysis of the logistics review, Evelyn said. I did not go looking for evidence of misconduct. I found a financial irregularity, and I followed it using the internal records that are part of my normal working access. The same records would have shown the same results, regardless of who ran the analysis. She looked at Pressman. "In fact, I'd like to ask don't," Grant's voice. Flat, stripped of performance. She looked at him. "Don't do this," he said, and for the first time in 6 years, he sounded like someone speaking without the machinery running, just a man saying a thing he meant. "You don't understand what you're in the middle of. You've handed these people a weapon, and you think you're protected because you work here, now. You're not protected, Evelyn, you're exposed." "To what?" she said. "To the way this family operates." He leaned forward. His attorney touched his arm lightly, a professional don't, which he ignored. "You think Dashiell is the safe version of this situation. You think he's the reasonable uncle who noticed you were unhappy and offered you a job. That's what you think." The room was very still. "Tell me what you think," she said. Grant looked at Dashiell, then back at her. "Ask him why he had you analyze the Antwerp contract. Specifically, ask him why that contract, that week, when the audit team had already been sitting on it for 6 months. Evelyn did not look at Dashiell. She kept her eyes on Grant. "Because I found it faster," she said, "in 2 days. Which tells you something about the audit team. It tells you he gave you the right file," Grant said. "At the right moment, when he needed a source that would be harder to discredit than an internal auditor." His voice was controlled again, the machinery back online. "You're not his employee, Evelyn. You're his instrument. And you handed him everything he needed to remove me from this family's organization, without getting his own hands into it." The silence in the room was the kind that has weight. She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at Dashiell. Dashiell was watching her. His expression was the closed, precise stillness she had learned to read, and she read it now as carefully as she had ever read anything in her professional life. She was looking for confirmation or denial. She was looking for the micro-expression, the thing a trained person could not entirely conceal, when a true thing was said directly in front of them. She found nothing she could name with certainty. That was its own kind of answer. It did not mean Grant was right, but it meant she did not know, and not knowing in this room, at this table, with her name unattached to documents in an investigation that had just had its integrity formally challenged, was no longer a position she could afford. "I need a recess," she said. Dashiell said 10 minutes. She stood. She left the boardroom. She walked to the end of the corridor, where a window seat overlooked the back garden, and she sat there, and she put her hands flat on her thighs and breathed. She thought, what do you actually know? She knew the documents were real. She had not fabricated them. She knew the discrepancy was real. She had followed it correctly. She knew that Grant had been stealing from WMH. Whatever his attorney was arguing about evidentiary chains and conflict of interest, that fact was factual. She also knew that Dashiell had given her specifically the Antwerp contract to analyze, and that the internal audit team had possessed the same information for 6 months without escalating it, and that the sequence of events that had placed her in this room, with her name on these documents on this particular Thursday, had been partly shaped by a man who shaped things with the same invisible efficiency he brought to everything else. That did not make her wrong, but it meant she had been used as well as employed. Margot appeared at the end of the corridor with a glass of water, which she set on the window ledge without comment, and then remained, standing 3 feet away, which was the version of presence that Margot offered when she understood that company was needed and words were not. "Did you know?" Evelyn said. "Know what specifically?" Margot said. "That he'd send me to the Antwerp file." Margot was quiet for long enough that the quiet itself became an answer of sorts. "He trusts your judgment," she said finally. "He trusted it before he offered you the position." "That's not what I asked." "No," Margot said, "it's not." Evelyn looked at her water. She did not pick it up. "Grant is taking everything he can reach," Margot said quietly. "The money was one thing. But what he said in that room, the suggestion that Dashiell used you, he said it because he knows that making you doubt everything is the fastest way to make you useless to everyone, including yourself." She paused. "That's what he does. You know that better than I do." Evelyn sat with that. She did know that. 6 years of knowing it, of experiencing the specific methodology of a man who understood that a woman who doubted herself was a woman who stayed. She also knew that knowing a thing did not make it simple. She picked up the water. She drank half of it. "I need to know something from Dashiell," she said, "before I go back in that room." "Then ask him," Margot said. She found Dashiell in the small study adjacent to the boardroom, which was where he went between meetings, where there was no art on the walls and a single chair beside a window, and the impression of a room that served one function, thinking. She closed the door. "Did you give me that contract? Because you knew what I'd find," she said. No preamble, no softening. He looked at her from the chair. "Yes," he said. The word landed in the room and stayed there. "You knew about Grant before the audit." "I had a reasonable suspicion for approximately 4 months," he said. "The audit team was careful. They were concerned about the implications of confirming what they suspected. Because it's your nephew. Because of what confirming it would require," he said. "Which is not the same thing." She looked at him. "And you needed someone who wouldn't be careful." "I needed someone who would do the work correctly. And completely," he said. "And who would be credible in the room when the findings were challenged. I considered several options. You considered me. You have an established professional record. You have direct access to the financial systems as part of your legitimate role. You are not a WMH insider in the traditional sense, which means you carry a different kind of authority. And I'm his wife," she said, "which makes me the last person anyone would expect to bring the case against him." Dashiell said nothing. "Which also makes me the person he'll spend the most energy discrediting," she said. "Yes," Dashiell said. She stood in the doorway of that small room and felt the shape of the situation fully for the first time, not the edges of it, not the part she had been operating inside, but the whole architecture of it, the position she had been placed in, the use that had been made of her competence and her access and her position as Grant's wife, and the fact that all of that was also, simultaneously, real. The work was real. The findings were real. The professional relationship was real, and holding both truths at once was the most difficult thing she had done in 8 weeks of difficult things. "You should have told me," she said. "If I had told you, you would have approached the analysis differently," he said. "You would have been looking for something rather than finding it. The distinction matters legally. It matters to me personally," she said. "You used my marriage. You used the fact that I'm inside this family in a way no auditor could be." "I used your skill," he said. "The marriage was a condition, not a tool. That's a very clean distinction for something that isn't clean at all." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "it isn't. There was no performance in that. no management. Just a man acknowledging an accurate thing. She stood there. She thought about the emerald dress, and the morning with her hands loose on the steering wheel, and the first time she'd put a document on his desk, and he'd said send them, and she had understood that she was good at this, that she had never stopped being good at it, that 3 years of erosion had not reached all the way down to where the competence lived. She thought about Grant in the boardroom, saying, "You're not protected, Evelyn. You're exposed," and the terrifying possibility that he was partially correct for entirely wrong reasons. "I'm going back in that room," she said. "I know," Dashiell said. "And I'm presenting those findings because they're accurate, not because of what it does to Grant or what it does for you. Because they're accurate, and I did the work correctly." "Yes," he said. "After this is done," she said, "I need to know exactly what you knew and when, and you're going to tell me all of it." Every piece. Dashiell held her gaze. "Yes," he said again. "I will." She turned and walked back down the corridor toward the boardroom, where her husband was waiting with his attorney and his strategy and his certainty that she would, at the last moment, choose the familiar safety of silence over the terrifying exposure of truth. She opened the boardroom door. Grant looked up. She sat down, opened her folder, and looked at Pressman. "Continue," she said. And in that single word, in the steadiness of it, in the fact that it did not waver, to green scene. Evelyn Marlowe committed to the version of herself she had been building for 8 weeks, without knowing that was what she was building, the woman who did not need the room to be safe before she told the truth. Because she had finally understood that the room was never going to be safe, and that waiting for it to become safe was the oldest and most expensive mistake she had ever made. Pressman continued. He continued for 41 minutes, and in those 41 minutes, the room moved through a sequence of emotional temperatures that Evelyn tracked with the detached precision of someone who has committed to a thing and is now simply executing it. The early minutes were the coldest procedural, document-heavy, Pressman's voice moving through the audit findings with the careful heat of someone who understood that the facts would generate sufficient heat on their own, without any assistance from his tone. Grant's attorney interrupted 4 times. Each interruption was technically framed questions about methodology, chain of custody, a sound like green upment, the structural about Evelyn's involvement that Halverson had raised in the opening and was now weaving through the presentation like a thread she intended to pull at the end and unravel everything. She was good. Evelyn acknowledged this internally, without letting it show on her face. Halverson was doing exactly what she had been paid to do, which was construct an alternative narrative, not that the misconduct hadn't occurred, but that the process of uncovering it was compromised enough to make consequence impossible. It was a defensive strategy built for delay, not exoneration. Pressman handled the interruptions with the composure of someone who had expected them. He acknowledged each point, addressed it with documentation, and moved forward. The board members, 7 of them, ranging from a 70-year-old man named Carver, who had known Dashiell's father, to a 40-something woman named Reyes, who ran the International Logistics Division with the precision of a military operation, listened without expression, which was its own language, and Evelyn was reading it. They were not surprised. Not all of them. Carver, perhaps. But the others, she could see it in the stillness, the absence of shock, the particular quality of people absorbing a confirmation rather than a revelation. They had suspected. Perhaps the full architecture, not the precise numbers, but the outline of it had been present in their awareness for long enough that this morning was not the beginning of something for them. It was the formal making official of something that had existed in the category of unaddressed. Grant was watching the room the way a pilot watches instrumentation, when the readings have stopped making sense rapidly, across multiple points, looking for the indicator that would tell him where the emergency was coming from. He found Carver. "Raymond," he said during Pressman's shift between documents. His voice had the register of someone trying to locate an ally in a room that had stopped performing that function. "You've known this family for 40 years. You know how these arrangements work. You know the consulting structure has always been." Grant, Dashiell's voice. Not loud. It did not need to be loud. Grant stopped. "You'll have the opportunity to respond formally," Dashiell said. "That process will be respected. What you won't do is use this room to lobby individual members during the presentation. A silence. Grant's jaw moved. He looked at his attorney, who gave him the microscopic headshake of a professional, indicating that her client should stop talking. He stopped talking. Pressman continued. By the time the presentation concluded at 11:47, the numbers on the table were precise and unambiguous: $463,000 in fraudulent consulting disbursements over 18 months, structured through an LLC that Grant had established and controlled, invoiced against projects that either did not exist or had been completed by WMH internal staff without external consultation. The documentation supported each finding individually. The pattern of the findings, taken together, supported only one interpretation. Halverson stood. She presented the counter-argument for 22 minutes. It was, Evelyn thought, impressive in its construction, a layered challenge to the evidentiary process that did not deny the existence of the payments, but questioned whether the process that had surfaced them could survive legal scrutiny, centering particularly on Evelyn's role, her conflict of interest. The argument that a wife investigating her husband's finances for his uncle constituted a tainted process, regardless of what the finances showed. Evelyn sat through it. She had prepared for this. When Halverson finished, Evelyn opened her folder and removed a single document she had not included in the original audit package, a document she had not prepared for Dashiell, had not shown Pressman, had not mentioned to anyone. She had found it the night after the boardroom recess, at 11:20 in the evening, sitting at her desk in the home office while Grant slept in the next room, or did not sleep. She had not checked. She had gone back through the full financial record, not looking for anything, looking for everything. The way she had been trained to look, the way you did when you needed to know the complete shape of a thing, and not just the portion that had been surfaced. What she found was a second LLC, different name, different registration date. Same structural fingerprint, same Delaware registered agent, same accounting firm, same pattern of quarterly disbursements. This one connected to a separate WMH contract from 2019, the year she and Grant had married, the year she had left Hargrove at his request. She had sat with that document for a long time. She slid it across the table to Pressman. He looked at it. His expression did not change, but his hand, reaching for his coffee cup, stopped. "This is from the 2019 infrastructure contract," she said. "The second LLC predates the Antwerp arrangement by 3 years. The total disbursements combined are not $463,000. She kept her voice even. It cost her. "They are $1.2 million, the room inhaled. Grant's chair moved. "That document wasn't in the audit package," Halverson said immediately. "Where did WMH internal financial records?" Evelyn said. "Accessible through my standard operational access. Same source as the original findings." She looked at Halverson. "You raised a question about the integrity of the evidentiary process. I'd like to suggest that a document uncovered independently, by the same process, using the same access through a separate search and arriving at the same conclusion, addresses your concern about curated findings." Halverson looked at her portfolio. Grant stood up. "Evelyn." His voice had lost the controlled register entirely. It was the voice from the kitchen on Wednesday night, but stripped of even the residual management, raw and sharp, and aimed at her directly. "You need to stop." She looked at him. "Sit down, Grant," Dashiell said. "She doesn't know what she's doing." He was not looking at Dashiell. He was looking at her, and the look was the one she had seen in the boardroom earlier, and was seeing now fully assembled, all its components present and visible, the calculation, the recognition that the situation had moved beyond his ability to redirect it, and, beneath those, something older and more personal that she identified after a moment as the specific fury of a man who has lost control of something he believed was his to control permanently. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she said. "You're destroying our marriage over a paperwork dispute." "You destroyed our marriage over $463,000, she said. "As it turns out, $1.2 million. That money he stopped. Started again. You don't understand the context." "Then explain it." "Not in this room. This is the room we're in, Grant." He looked at the board members. At Carver, who was looking at his hands. At Reyes, who was looking at Grant with the expression of someone who has received a confirmation she did not want. He looked at Dashiell, who was watching him with the stillness of someone who has made a decision and is waiting for the situation to catch up to it. Grant sat down. The meeting concluded at 12:31. The aftermath of the meeting had the particular quality of air after a storm, everything technically normal, reconfigured slightly, with a new arrangement of things that you had to keep noticing because your brain kept trying to map the old positions over the new ones. Evelyn was in the corridor, putting her documents back, in order when Grant's hand closed around her arm. Not violently. It was not that she was clear on that, because it mattered to be clear on it. It was the grip of someone who needed a physical anchor for a conversation they could not afford to have in a room with witnesses, firm and specific, and removing her from the direction she had been moving. She went still. "You had that document last night," he said. His voice was low, close to her ear, the quality of private fury. "You found it, and you sat at your desk, and you decided to save it for this room. To perform it. Like a let go of my arm," she said. He did not immediately, Grant. Her voice was flat. "Let go of my arm," he released her. She turned to face him. They were in the side corridor, off the main hallway, not visible from the boardroom entrance, not visible from the front door. It was the accidental privacy of a large house. And she was aware of it the way she had become aware of the geography of rooms which exits existed, where other people were, the distance between here and somewhere else. "You saved it," he said again, not accusing now, something more desperate in it, and she recognized the desperation as the moment a person stops executing the strategy and starts reacting to what's actually happening. "I found it last night," she said. "I included it because it was part of the full picture. You could have come to me." And said what? He looked at her. His eyes were doing something she hadn't seen before. The controlled surface was fully down. And what was underneath was not what she had expected. Not rage, not calculation. Something more fractured. Something that looked, she thought, like the face of a person who has been running a particular race for a very long time and has just understood they are not going to finish it the way they planned. "We could have fixed this," he said. "If you had come to me first, there were arrangements. People who would have helped." "People," she said. "Yes, Dashiell's organization." Grant's expression shifted. His legitimate organization. His Evelyn, this is a family company. Things get handled within the family. "Not this time," she said. "Because of you. Because of what you did," she said. "You don't get to hand me the outcome of your choices and call it something I caused." He pressed both hands against the wall beside her, not trapping her, the gesture of someone containing their own body rather than hers, pressing against something solid because the alternative was coming apart in a corridor. She watched him do it. She did not step back. 6 years, he said, and the way he said it was different from how he had said it in the boardroom. Not an invoice this time. Something else. "I know I wasn't. I know things weren't what they should have been. I know that." She looked at him. "But you were supposed to be." He stopped. "You were the one thing that wasn't part of all this. You understand? You were separate from it. From the theft," she said. "From the operational complexity. Yes. You were outside of it." He looked at her with the fractured expression. "And then you walked into his building, and you became part of it. And now you're the person who—" "I didn't walk into his building to become part of anything," she said. "I walked in because you humiliated me in front of 100 people and then didn't come looking for me for 14 minutes. A silence. He looked at her. "I was talking to Carver," he said. "I know," she said. Something in his face changed then slowly, the way a landscape changes when the light shifts not dramatically, not all at once, but progressively, until you look up and everything is different from what it was. He looked at her and she watched him understand, perhaps for the first time, that she had been counting the minutes. That she had stood at a window for 14 minutes and counted, and that the counting had been the thing, had been the moment when she understood what she had always known but had refused to confirm. "Evelyn," he said. "I'm filing for divorce," she said. "My attorney will contact yours." She picked up her folder. She walked back to the main corridor. The Whitlock estate had a garden at the back, accessible through a pair of glass doors at the end of the east wing, and Evelyn went there because she needed air that wasn't inside the building where the last 3 hours had occurred. The garden in November was stripped down, the plantings pulled back for the season, but the structure of it remained the stone paths, the low walls, the specific quality of open space that allowed you to breathe all the way down. She stood on the path and breathed all the way down. She heard the glass doors behind her and knew without turning who it was. Dashiell stopped beside her. He did not say anything for a moment, which was characteristic, the patience of someone who did not use words as filler. "You had the second document last night," he said. "Yes. And you made the decision about when to present it yourself." "Yes." He was quiet. "You're going to tell me I should have disclosed it immediately," she said. "No," he said. "I'm going to tell you that the way you disclosed it was strategically effective and legally sound, and that you made that determination under significant pressure in under 12 hours. He paused. "I'm also going to tell you that it required a kind of steadiness that most people in your position wouldn't have had." She looked at the stone path. "I need to know what happens next," she said. "To Grant. Specifically, the board will recommend referral to the appropriate legal authorities," Dashiell said. "I won't intervene in that process. The evidence is too clear and too documented for it to be handled internally, which I think you already understood when you produced the second document." "Yes," she said. "The referral will likely occur within the week. After that, it's out of my hands." She absorbed this. "And my position at WMH," she said, "is unchanged," Dashiell said. "Unless you decide otherwise." She turned to look at him. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, looking at the same stone path she had been looking at, and she had the sudden, strange sensation of seeing him as a complete picture rather than in the fragments she had been assembling over the course of 8 weeks. A man who operated in a world built on the management of consequence. A man who had given her an opportunity and also used her for a specific purpose and had told her the truth about it when she asked directly. A man who had not laughed at a birthday dinner. "You owe me the full account," she said. "What you knew when you knew it. Why you chose me and not an internal resource." "Yes," he said. "Tonight," she said. He looked at her. "Tonight," he said. She nodded. She went back inside. The full account took 2 hours, conducted in the small study, with the no-art walls and the single chair beside the window. Evelyn sat in the chair. Dashiell stood, which was how he thought, moving occasionally to the window and back, and he told her everything with the same directness he brought to everything, no embellishment, no strategic softening, just the sequence of events as they had occurred. He had become aware of the potential misconduct 7 months ago through discrepancy flagged by Reyes during an internal logistics review. He had commissioned a quiet investigation through the audit team, which had proceeded slowly and cautiously, for the reasons she had already identified. The subject was a family member, the implications were severe, and the internal team was constitutionally incapable of proceeding with the speed and decisiveness the situation required. He had identified Evelyn as a potential resource when she walked into his building with his card and sat across his desk and told him she could do the work. Her professional record was part of it. Her access as Grant's wife, as someone who moved through the family's social architecture without raising flags, was part of it. Her position outside the traditional WMH structure meant her findings carried a different credibility than an internal auditor's findings would carry under challenge. He had given her the Antwerp file because it was the right file at the right time. A sound like green wood splitting, and because he had watched her work for 8 weeks and understood that she would follow the thread correctly and completely and with the kind of professional precision that would make the findings legally solid. "Did you know she'd be in the room?" Evelyn said. Halverson. "I suspected he'd bring legal counsel," Dashiell said. "I didn't know the specific strategy until she raised it in the opening. The conflict of interest argument. Yes, which you'd thought about." A pause, which I had considered as a risk, he said. And accepted. She sat with that. "The second document," she said. "Did you know it existed?" Dashiell looked at her. "No," he said. She believed him. A sound like green wood splitting, not because she was predisposed to believe him. She had been running every statement through the same filter since the boardroom. The filter of a woman who had just learned that her competence had been a strategic instrument as well as a professional reality, and who was adjusting for that without abandoning the professional reality. She believed him because his expression, when Pressman had looked at the document, had been the micro-expression of genuine surprise, contained in under 2 seconds, which was fast enough that most people wouldn't catch it. She had caught it. The 1.2 million changes the legal landscape significantly, she said. Yes, for Grant. Yes, she was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the garden had gone dark, the November evening coming down fast, and the lights, the study was the particular amber of a lamp in a room where significant things were being said plainly. I told him I'm filing for divorce, she said. Dashiell's expression remained controlled. I know Margot told you. Margot tells me what I need to know. Evelyn looked at her hands in her lap. They were steady, which she noted and moved past. She had stopped tracking her hands as a measure of her internal state, because the measure had become unreliable. She could be falling apart on the inside and hold her hands steady now. She had learned that in the boardroom at 11:47, when she had slid the second document across the table. I need you to understand something, she said. He waited. What I did today, the presentation, the second document, the decision about timing, that was mine. My professional judgment. Not loyalty to you. Not anger at Grant. Not gratitude for the job. She looked up at him. Mine, I know, he said. I need you to keep knowing that, she said. Because what comes next, whatever the legal process looks like, whatever my position at WMH looks like, I need to be operating as a professional in my own right. Not as your instrument. Not as Grant's wife. Mine. Dashiell looked at her for a long moment. Is a board vote next month, he said. For a newly created position, Director of Executive Operations. The role was constructed around a competency gap that became apparent over the past quarter. He paused. Around a specific kind of competency gap. She looked at him. You're offering me a promotion, she said. Today. I'm informing you of an upcoming board vote, he said. The vote will go the way votes go. Today, she said again. The timing is poor, he acknowledged. I'm aware of that. She almost laughed. Not from humor, exactly, from the specific absurdity of standing in a room where her marriage had just ended and being handed a professional advancement in the same conversation. The world did not pause for emotional sequence. She had known that. She was relearning it at speed. I'll consider it, she said. She stood. She was at the door of the study when his voice reached her. Evelyn. She turned. He was standing beside the window with the amber lamp behind him and the dark garden behind the glass, and she searched for the word and found it constrained. Like a man who was accustomed to taking up his full amount of space in a situation and was choosing not to. What you said in the boardroom, he said. When Grant accused me of engineering this. When you said I said continue, she said. To Pressman. Yes, he said. I know what it cost to say it at that moment. She looked at him. Do you, she said. I have some idea, he said. Then you know why I need the next thing to be entirely my own, she said. Whatever it is. He held her gaze, he said. I know. She left the study. She walked through the Whitlock estate, through the east corridor and the main hall, and past the boardroom, where the chairs had been pushed back and the documents stacked and the machinery of consequence set in motion. She came and she came out. Through the front entrance into the November dark. Her car was in the drive. She sat in it for a moment without starting the engine. She thought about the second document. About finding it at 11:20 in the home office, with Grant asleep or not asleep in the next room, and the way the number had reconfigured in front of her eyes, not 463,000, but 1.2 million. A number that turned a serious problem into a criminal exposure of an entirely different scale, and the decision she had made in that moment about what to do with it. She had not called Dashiell. She had not called an attorney. She had sat at her desk and held the knowledge for 4 hours, and made the decision herself alone, in a house that no longer felt like her home, and possibly had never been the decision that this was a document for the boardroom. for the formal process, for the institutional machinery that Dashiell had said he would not circumvent, and that she had decided she would not circumvent either. Because the only way out of a situation built on compromised processes was through a process that wasn't. She had made that decision alone. That was hers. She started the engine. The drive back to Manhattan was an hour in the November dark, and Evelyn drove it with both hands on the wheel and the specific clarity of someone who has gone through something and come out the other side, not unscathed. She was under no illusion about the scathing, but standing. Her phone lit up on the passenger seat. She did not look at it until she hit the first stoplight on the expressway. It was a text from Grant's number. She looked at it for the length of the red light. "You have no idea what you've started." She set the phone face down on the seat. The light changed. She drove. What she did not know yet, what she would not learn until 7:40 the following morning, a soundtesis, when a call from an unknown number reached her before she had finished her first cup of coffee, was that Grant had not gone home after the board meeting either, and that the night he had spent in the hours between the Whitlock estate and her unanswered text had not been spent in the particular kind of collapse she might have expected, but in motion, in the deliberate assembly of the last tools, available to a man who understood that the institutional machinery was now aimed at him, and that the only remaining option was to reach outside the institution entirely. She would learn at 7:40 the following morning that the unknown number belonged to a federal investigator named Hartley, and that Hartley had been building a separate case, a larger case, for 14 months, and that Grant had spent the previous night having a conversation with people whose interest in the Whitlock organization went considerably beyond $1.2 million in fraudulent consulting disbursements. And she would understand, in the 5 seconds of silence, after Hartley said her name and his title, and the words, "We need to speak with you," as soon as possible, that the threshold she had crossed in the boardroom had not been the last one. It had been the first one. The call came at 7:43 in the morning, and Evelyn was already awake. She had been awake since 5:30, which had become the pattern in the weeks since the board meeting, her body refusing the fiction of rest, cycling through the hours with the specific alertness of someone whose nervous system had not yet received the memo that the immediate crisis was over. She had made coffee at 6. She had stood at the window, watching the East River move through the early light, and tried to let the motion of the water do what moving water is supposed to do, which is remind you that things continue. It helped, partially. The 202 area code registered, before she fully processed that she was answering. Washington. She knew one person in Washington, and it was not this number. Mrs. Marlowe. "My name is Daniel Hartley. I'm a senior investigator with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Division." The voice was measured, professional, carrying the particular cadence of someone who made calls like this before most people had finished their first cup of coffee and had learned that directness was the only form of courtesy that held up at 7:40 in the morning. "I apologize for the hour. I need to speak with you today if that's workable." She set down her coffee cup without drinking from it. "About what specifically?" she said. "About your husband. About Whitlock Meridian Holdings, and about a conversation your husband had last night with 2 of my colleagues." 3 seconds of silence in which she understood the shape of everything. "He went to you," she said. "He initiated contact, yes. Through an intermediary late yesterday evening. I can't characterize the specifics over the phone, but your name has become relevant to an investigation that predates yesterday's board meeting by 14 months. Speaking with us voluntarily and promptly is in your interest." She moved to the kitchen table and sat down. Not because she needed to sit, her legs were fine, but because the conversation required the posture of someone who was going to think clearly, rather than the posture of someone standing at a window, waiting for water to move. "I'll need legal counsel present," she said. "Of course. 2:00 this afternoon. Send me the address." She hung up. She sat for exactly 1 minute without moving, which was the time she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what Grant had done, not surprised by it. She was past surprise, but present with the specific exhaustion of learning that the damage a person does not stop when you stop being in the room with them. Then she picked up the phone again and called Patricia Vance. Patricia answered on the second ring, which was one of the things Evelyn valued about her. I need you today, Evelyn said. Tell me, Patricia said. Evelyn told her. Patricia Vance arrived at the federal building on Worth Street at 1:45 in a charcoal blazer with a legal pad and the expression of someone who had walked into rooms like this often enough. That the rooms no longer held any advantage over her. She was 61, had practiced federal litigation for 30 years, and possessed the specific quality of someone who had stopped being impressed by institutional authority while remaining entirely functional within its requirements. She looked at Evelyn in the lobby and said whatever he told them, he told it to save himself. That means his account is shaped around his necessity, not around accuracy. Keep that in front of you the entire time. Evelyn said she would. They were shown to a conference room on the 4th floor. Hartley was already there with a second investigator named Chen who was younger and took notes with the focused efficiencies of someone building a record rather than following a conversation. The room had the standard configuration of these rooms: table, chairs, water pitcher, window, looking at another building, and Evelyn noted all of it and set it aside and looked at Hartley. He was a compact man in his early 50s with a slightly tired face, and the eyes of someone who had been doing consequential work for a long time without adequate public acknowledgement. She found to her own mild surprise that she trusted the face. Not the institution, she was not naive about institutions, but the specific human being sitting across the table, who looked like a person who was trying to find out what was true rather than construct what was convenient. He began without preamble, which she appreciated. The investigation had originated 14 months ago from a separate federal inquiry into the financial architecture of 3 East Coast shipping networks. Whitlock Meridian Holdings had appeared peripherally in that inquiry, not as a primary target, but as an organization whose legitimate infrastructure overlapped geographically and operationally with networks of interest. The investigation had been monitored than watching the organizational structure for anything that warranted closer attention. Grant had appeared 8 months ago when a financial analyst reviewing WMH's publicly available disclosures had flagged an unusual pattern in the consulting disbursements. Not the amounts; those were not unusual for a company of WMH's scale, but the frequency and timing structure which matched a technique the analyst had seen in previous cases: the gradual conversion of institutional funds into an untraceable liquidity through a long-running arrangement that was designed to look routine. The analyst had flagged it. Hartley had opened a quiet parallel track. They had been building for 8 months when Grant, the previous evening, had contacted them through an intermediary. He indicated he was prepared to provide information about the operational structure of Whitlock Meridian Holdings, Hartley said, about activities that extend beyond the financial misconduct documented in yesterday's board meeting, in exchange for substantial consideration regarding his own criminal exposure. He's trading Dashiell, Evelyn said. He's attempting to, Hartley said. Yes, Patricia said, carefully. And the information he provided last night, how does my client factor into it? Hartley looked at Evelyn directly, and the look was the evaluating kind, not aggressive, but thorough, the look of someone determining what kind of person they are dealing with before deciding how to proceed. Your husband characterized your position at WMH as deliberately arranged by Dashiell Whitlock, he said. He stated that your access to internal financial records was not incidental to your role, but was structured specifically to provide cover in an internal investigation that Whitlock wanted to conduct without his own fingerprints on it. He characterized you as his word, an instrument. The word landed in the room. Evelyn sat with it. She had heard the word before in the study with the amber lamp, from Dashiell's own mouth, delivered with the honesty she had demanded. The difference was context. When Dashiell had said it, he had been acknowledging a partial truth in order to give her the complete picture. When Grant said it, he was using it as architecture building a version of events in which Evelyn was either complicit or deceived, either a willing participant in a scheme or a naive conduit for one, and either version served the same purpose: to make the case that the evidence Evelyn had found and presented could not be trusted because the person who found it could not be trusted. It was, she thought, the most sophisticated thing Grant had done in their entire marriage. She acknowledged this without admiration. He's reversed the narrative, Patricia said. Grant Marlowe is now presenting himself as the victim of a coordinated effort by Dashiell Whitlock to remove him from the organization, using Evelyn as the mechanism. That is the characterization. Yes, Hartley said. And your assessment of that characterization? Patricia said. Hartley looked at his folder, then at Evelyn. That's part of what I'm here to determine. She had been measuring how much to say from the beginning of the conversation, running the calculus that Patricia had outlined in the lobby, that whatever served truth served her, and whatever filtered truth served no one except Grant, and that the investigators across the table were capable of identifying the difference between a managed account and an honest one. She had also been measuring Hartley, specifically, the particular quality of his attention, whether he was building a case or looking for facts. She had decided he was looking for facts. She opened her mouth and told him everything. Not the edited version, not the version optimized for her own protection. Everything. The birthday dinner and Margot's card and the professional record Dashiell had researched, and the 8 weeks of work and the specific morning she had been handed the Antwerp file, and the 2 days of analysis a seconds, and the conversation in the study where Dashiell had confirmed he had known for 7 months and had selected her for specific reasons. She told them about the 7 months. She told them about the audit team's hesitation. She told them about the reasons he had given her and the reasons she had assessed independently. And she told them about 11:20 at night, the home office. Grant asleep or not asleep in the next room. The second LLC registration, appearing in the financial records, not because anyone had directed her there, but because she had gone back to the beginning, the way she always went back to the beginning when she needed to know the full shape of something, and not just the part that had been surfaced. The 1.2 million. The decision she had made alone about what to do with it and when. Hartley listened without interrupting. Chen's pen moved steadily. Patricia sat with the contained attentiveness of someone who is simultaneously monitoring the conversation and ready to intervene if it moves into territory that requires it. When Evelyn finished, Hartley was quiet for a moment. The second document, he said. You found it independently. No direction from Whitlock. No direction from anyone, she said. It was 11:20 at night. I was alone. I went back through the full record because that's how I work. And the decision to present it the following morning, in the board meeting timing, context, the strategic placement of it after Halverson's challenge to your credibility, that was yours. Yes. Why not call Whitlock the night before? Tell him what you found. She looked at him. Because if I had called him, the decision about how and when to use the document would have become partly his. I wanted it to be entirely mine, for reasons that I think you understand given the context. Hartley looked at her for a long moment. Mrs. Marlowe, he said, what you've described, as it pertains to Dashiell Whitlock's conduct toward you specifically, is a man who used your professional access and your position within the family structure for a legitimate institutional purpose through methods that were calculated but not illegal. Is that your characterization? That is my characterization, she said. He used my competence strategically. He was honest with me about that when I asked directly. The use was real, and the competence was also real, and I don't believe those two things cancel each other out. And within the scope of your working access, the legitimate organizational functions you've been involved in, you have no direct knowledge of activities that fall outside the legitimate corporate structure. In my area, no, she said. I'm aware of his reputation. I'm aware of what the Whitlock name carries in certain contexts. I have never been given access to or direct knowledge of anything that wasn't connected to the logistics, scheduling, and executive operations functions of the legitimate company. Patricia interjected here, cleanly and precisely, to note the scope limitation of that statement. Evelyn acknowledged it with a small nod. Hartley sat back. He looked at his folder. He looked at Chen. He looked at the water pitcher that no one had touched. Your husband's account, he said, requires you to have been either actively complicit in a scheme to construct false evidence against him, or passively manipulated to the same end. Your account requires the evidence to be real and your methodology to be sound. with the complicating factor that the person who gave you the initial assignment had a pre-existing interest in the outcome. He paused. Those two accounts are not equally supported by the documentary record we have independent access to. No, Evelyn said. They're not. The inconsistencies in your husband's account, Hartley said carefully, are specific and verifiable. The LLC registration dates, the account connection timeline, the internal audit record which shows the discrepancy was flagged by your colleague Reyes 8 months ago and was present in the system before you joined the organization. He closed his folder. We will need you available for follow-up as the investigation develops. I'd ask that you not discuss the content of this conversation with Mr. Whitlock in the near term. Understood, Patricia said. They left the building at 5:20. The afternoon had gone fully gray while they were inside, the kind of overcast that makes the city look like a pencil drawing of itself. Patricia stopped on the sidewalk and looked at Evelyn with the obsessing directness she reserved for conversations where the professional and the personal were occupying the same space. You told them things that created complications for yourself, Patricia said. I told them true things, Evelyn said. Some true things were not yours to volunteer. The true things about how Dashiell used my position, those were mine to volunteer, because they were my experience. And because if I filtered them, every true thing I said afterward would have the shadow of the filtering over it. She looked down the street at the moving traffic. I've spent 6 years having my account of reality filtered by someone else's necessity. I'm not doing it again, not even in my own interest. Patricia was quiet for a moment. All right, she said. Stay available. Don't initiate contact with Whitlock about this specific conversation. Call me before you respond to anything else that comes in. Evelyn said she would. She took the subway home, standing in the car with one hand on the overhead bar, and let the motion of the train through the underground dark be what it was, purposeful, unglamorous, moving her from one place to another, without requiring anything from her except that she hold on. She held on. She did not sleep well that night, which she had anticipated, and she did not try to force it. Sop's scene, with the lights off. She lay in the bed faintly, through the window, and she had left slightly open, and she went through the conversation, with Hartley the way she went through financial documents, not looking for errors, just looking for the complete shape of it, the thing she might have missed. She had not missed anything. What she had was the specific, uncomfortable clarity of someone who has done a complicated thing as correctly as a complicated thing can be done, and who understands that doing it correctly does not insulate you from its complications. She had handed a federal investigator an honest account of a situation in which the man she worked for had used her strategically, and she had done it because the alternative was to build her safety on a filtered version of events. And she had learned at some cost she was still in the process of tabulating what it meant to live inside someone else's edited version of reality. She was not going back to that. She slept at around 3 in the morning and woke at 6:15, which was enough. 3 weeks passed. The federal investigation moved the way federal investigations moved, which was to say, slowly, in directions that were not always visible from outside the process, with occasional signals that something had shifted and long periods of apparent that contained beneath the surface the grinding machinery of institutional consequence. Grant's cooperative overture had complicated his position rather than simplified it, which Patricia had assessed as probable from the beginning. The account he had offered was inconsistent in specific places that the investigators were able to cross-reference against Evelyn's account, against Pressman's documentation, against the independent financial record. A cooperative witness whose account didn't hold together was worse than no witness at all. It raised questions about the quality of everything else they were offering. Halverson, she learned through the divorce attorney, had advised against the approach from the start. Grant had proceeded anyway. The divorce filing generated its own procedural machinery documents and responses and asset disclosures moving through the legal system with the specific patience of institutional process, which required her to be present without being consumed. She hired Frank Sorensen, who was known for the same qualities Patricia was known for, and she let Sorensen manage what Sorensen was built to manage. She went to work every morning, Park Avenue, the 22nd floor. The briefings and the schedules and the operational problems and the particular satisfaction of doing difficult things with precision in an environment where precision was valued. She had not spoken to Dashiell about the federal conversation. The instruction had been clear, and she honored it, but the quality of their professional relationship held steady in a way that she found, on reflection, to be its own kind of statement. He did not press her for information she wasn't offering. He gave her the work and trusted her to do it. That was not nothing. In the third week, on a Thursday afternoon, Raymond Carver called and asked if she would have coffee with him. She said yes before she had finished, thinking about whether she should. They met near Grand Central, at a small place. Carver had apparently been patronizing. For 3 decades, the man behind the counter had his order moving before he sat down, which was the specific shorthand of a long loyalty. Carver was 70 years old and looked like someone who had spent those years doing things that mattered and had the permanent tiredness of that kind of life without any apparent regret about having lived it. He looked at her across the small table with the expression of someone who had been working toward this conversation for a while. "I've been on that board for 19 years, he said. "I've been in a lot of difficult rooms." She waited, because he was going somewhere and interrupting him would waste the trip. "Grant was I watched him grow up," Carver said. "That complicates things. Not ethically. I'm clear about the ethics of it. But personally." He picked up his coffee and set it back down without drinking. "What you did in that room, with the second document, the way you timed it, the way you held yourself through Halverson's argument." He shook his head slowly. "I've seen a lot of people under pressure in boardrooms. I've seen people with a great deal more preparation and institutional protection than you had on that particular morning." He looked at her. "I've seen very few people do what you did the way you did it." She looked at her own coffee. "I did my job," she said. "You did considerably more than your job," he said. "But I didn't ask to see you to tell you that." He folded his hands on the table. "I asked to see you because there's something I think you should know, and because Dashiell would not tell you himself, because he is constitutionally incapable of saying certain things about himself without someone pointing a considerable amount of institutional authority at him first." She looked up. Carver said, "He has not been the same since the birthday dinner. I noticed it the following Monday when he came into the office, and there was something different about him, not his performance, not his work. Those were what they always are. Something underneath that. I didn't know what I was seeing until about 3 weeks later. And then I understood that I was seeing a man who had done something he considered important and didn't know whether it would amount to anything, and was sitting with that uncertainty in the way that a man like Dashiell sits with uncertainty, which is very quietly and with considerable self-control and without any visible indication that anything is happening at all." Evelyn was very still. "He gave me his card through Margot," she said, "at a dinner where I had just been publicly humiliated. That's what he did." "Yes," Carver said. "And do you know how long he waited before deciding to do that?" She did not. "He had Margot carry that card for 6 months," Carver said. "He saw what was happening at family events over 6 months, and he told Margot to give it to you at the right moment. He was waiting for the moment when you needed it most and would be most likely to use it. 6 months." She sat with that. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because you earned the right to know the full account," Carver said. A sound like green wood splitting, and because that man will spend the rest of his life working around what he feels, rather than through it, unless someone who is capable of demanding the full account from him actually does so. He drank his coffee. He did not say anything further on the subject, which was its own kind of eloquence. The board vote happened on a Tuesday in December, and Evelyn was at her desk when Dashiell's assistant came to the door of her office and said 7-0. She said thank you. She returned to the logistics review she had been running. An hour later, Dashiell appeared in her doorway. He looked at her in the way she had learned, the complete, unhurried attention, and said, "Director of Executive Operations. Effective the 1st of the year." 7-0, she said. "Yes." She looked at him. "I want a meeting before January," she said. "About the reporting structure. I have thoughts about how the East Coast Logistics Division should sit within the new arrangement, and I want to talk about the Q2 exposure before it becomes a Q3 problem." Friday morning, he said, 8 o'clock. 8 is fine. He was in the doorway for a moment longer, and she held the moment without filling it. And something in his expression moved almost imperceptibly, not the almost smile this time. Something more serious, more direct. The look of a man saying something without using words, because the words were in a category he had not yet opened. You did good work, he said. All of it. The way you handled the investigation I'm aware of, the position it put you in. She looked at him. I know what it cost, he said. I know you know, she said. That's one of the things about you that is not uncomplicated. A pause. No, he said, none of this has been uncomplicated. He left the doorway. She sat for a moment after he was gone and noticed that her chest felt different than it had, in the morning not lighter exactly, but more settled, the way a room feels after furniture has been moved to where it actually belongs. She opened the Q2 file. Christmas came and she drove to Philadelphia. Her sister Corfra lived in West Philadelphia in a row house that had been in her husband Marcus's family for 30 years and felt like it worn in the specific places where life was lived most often, comfortable in the way of things that have been used rather than preserved. Cora was 4 years older than Evelyn and had been watching the dissolution of her sister's marriage with the carefully controlled concern of someone who knew that expressing concern too directly would produce the opposite of the intended effect. Evelyn arrived on Christmas Eve with wine and the specific kind of travel tiredness that comes not from distance, but from everything the distance was putting between you and, temporarily, behind you. Cora opened the door and looked at her and said, You look like yourself again. It was not a small thing to say. Evelyn stood on the front steps in the cold and felt the truth of it without knowing quite how to answer. So she said, I brought the good burgundy. And Cora said, Then get inside. And that was enough. She spent 3 nights. She ate Cora's food, which was the kind of food that didn't have an aesthetic, it was just good, made by someone who cooked because people needed to eat, and because caring for people expressed itself most naturally through feeding them. She played board games with Cora's children and lost deliberately the first time, and less deliberately the second. And on Christmas night, she fell asleep on the living room couch before 11, which was the most complete sleep she had gotten since October. She woke the next morning to Marcus making coffee in the kitchen, and the specific quality of a house that was genuinely inhabited the sounds of children somewhere upstairs. Cora's voice, the ordinary, irreplaceable noise of a family functioning. She lay on the couch for a few minutes before getting up and held the sound of it, without feeling the particular ache she might have felt in another version of herself, the version that would have mapped her own circumstances against it and found the comparison painful. She did not feel that. What she felt was simpler. She was glad Cora had this, and she was glad to be here, and the gladness was clean. On the drive back to New York the day after Christmas, she stopped at a rest stop on the turnpike and sat in the car with a coffee that was substantially worse than anything she made at home and watched the trucks move through the gray afternoon and let herself think without agenda about what she wanted, not what she had survived. Not what the next procedural step was. What she wanted. She wanted her work. The director role and the operational complexity it would bring, and the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from doing something at the edge of your ability, which was the best kind. She wanted her apartment and her mornings. The walks she had reclaimed in November the city at 6:45, before the weight of its own ambition arrived fully, when it belonged to the people who were up because they had chosen to be, rather than because performance required it. She admitted to herself in the gray light of the New Jersey Turnpike, to know what it would be like to choose something for herself with the same completeness that she had brought to the boardroom on a November Thursday morning. To make a decision from strength rather than from the management of someone else's expectations. She had a sense of what that decision might be. She got back on the turnpike and drove toward New York with both hands on the wheel. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in February. Sorensen called it 10:15. Evelyn was in the director office. She had moved after the first of the year in the space on the 22nd that Dashiell had apparently been reserving for the role for longer than the board vote suggested, and she said thank. Ewan hung up and sat with the weight of it for exactly 12 minutes. She had loved Grant. She was not going to reconstruct that into something less than it had been, because the love had been real, even if what she loved had been partly constructed. And pretending the love wasn't real was the kind of revision that felt like freedom, and was actually a different kind of diminishment. She had loved him. It had cost her things she was still counting. Both of those facts were true simultaneously, and neither canceled the other. She sat with that for 12 minutes. Then she opened the Rotterdam file and worked until lunch. Grant's legal situation resolved over the following months in the way that situations of that complexity resolve slowly, without clean edges, with outcomes that satisfied no one entirely. The federal investigation eventually produced a negotiated arrangement that addressed his financial misconduct directly, without extending to the wider WMH structure, which Hartley had called to inform her of in March. Evelyn's account, combined with Pressman's documentation and the inconsistencies in Grant's cooperative narrative, had collectively undermined the credibility of what he had offered. The investigators had found the discrepancies too specific and too verifiable to overlook. Grant received a substantial financial penalty, a 2-year supervised arrangement, and the permanent removal of his position within any Whitlock-connected organization. The Marlowe family name provided some institutional cushion that Evelyn had no control over and did not spend energy resenting. He did not go to prison. He called her once, in late April. She let it go to voicemail. The message was 43 seconds of something adjacent to an apology, qualified, managed, constructed around his experience of the situation rather than hers. The apology of a man who was sorry about outcomes rather than conduct. She listened to it once, sitting at her kitchen table with her coffee, giving it the full 43 seconds and the fair attention it was owed. Then she set the phone face down on the table. She thought about calling back. She thought about what she'd say if she did, and whether saying it would cost more than it was worth, and what the value of it would be for her rather than for him. She did not call back. She deleted the voicemail 2 days later. Not immediately. She was not going to perform indifference she didn't feel. The message had been real. The 43 seconds had been real. The fact that it was inadequate did not make it nothing. She gave it 2 days. Then she deleted it and went to work. Spring came the way it always came to New York, not gently, not all at once, but in the specificity that doesn't ease into things, where one day the light is different, and 2 days later, the trees along Park Avenue have made a decision, and the morning air carries the temperature of something that wants to be warm rather than just not cold. Evelyn had been at Whitlock Meridian for 10 months. On a Thursday evening in late April, Dashiell appeared in the doorway of her office at 6:15, which was later than he typically comes unless there was something specific, and looked at her with the expression she had learned to read as the one that meant he had something to say that was not about the work. "Rooftop garden," he said, "when you're ready." She closed the Rotterdam file she had been updating. She was ready. The rooftop in late April was the version of something that has come back from a long time away, not fully arrived in, still finding its footing, but genuinely alive, in the way that made the winter's absence feel like it had been worth the wait. The plantings along the low walls had come back in varying degrees of commitment, and the air at this height carried the city's particular compound of energy and exhaust, and the faint mineral smell of the river several blocks east. Dashiell was at the north railing looking downtown. The lights of Manhattan spread out below them with the particular extravagance of a city that has never learned to be modest about its own existence. She came to stand beside him, the professional distance. An inch more than strangers, an inch less than people, pretending they had no history. "The Antwerp contract closed today," he said. "I know," she said. "Reyes sent the confirmation at 4:12. I was in a meeting, or I'd have come by. The Rotterdam restructuring is 42 days ahead of schedule." She looked at him sideways. "I run the Rotterdam restructuring. I'm aware of where it is." The almost smile arrived, and this time did not retreat. Pleaded itself, briefly, genuinely, the expression of a man who is being himself, rather than performing being himself, which was the rarest version of him and the one she had been most interested in for the better part of a year. She turned to face him. She had been carrying what she needed to say for long enough that it had settled into the kind of weight you stop noticing until you set it down. Carver told me about the card, she said. He was still. About the 6 months, she said. About telling Margot to wait for the right moment. He looked at the city. Not away from her, his body was still angled toward her, but his gaze went out toward the lights for a moment, and she recognized the gesture as the one he made when he was deciding how much of something to confirm rather than deny. Yes, he said. 6 months, she said. Yes. You watched what was happening at family events for 6 months and you had Margot carry your card and you waited. I couldn't intervene in your marriage, he said. You had not asked for intervention. Intervening without invitation is he stopped. It would have been a different kind of diminishment. She stood with that. So, you waited for the moment when I needed somewhere to go, she said. I waited for the moment when you might want one, he said. Those are different things. I couldn't know if you'd use the card. I didn't know if you'd come in. I gave you a card, which is an option, not a direction. She looked at him. And if I hadn't come in, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know, he said. I have thought about it. I don't know. It was the most uncertain thing she had ever heard him say, and she valued it precisely because it was honest, rather than managed. I need to say something, she said, and I need you to hear it correctly. He turned to face her. The full attention, undivided, complete the kind she had felt from across a birthday ballroom when everyone else was performing something else. What I feel for you is mine, she said, not gratitude for the job. Not confusion between professional respect and something else. Not the result of being in a difficult situation and attaching to the person who made it less difficult. I've thought about all of those possibilities carefully and with more honesty than they were comfortable to think about. And none of them is what this is. She held his gaze. I know the difference between needing someone and wanting them. I have lived inside not knowing the difference for long enough to be very clear about it now. This is wanting. That's what I'm telling you. The city made its ambient sound below them. And I need to know what you feel, she said, directly. Without the management, he looked at her for a moment that was long enough to be considered and short enough to be honest and honest. I have been trying to give you room, he said. Since before you walked into this building. Since before the birthday dinner, actually, though that was when it became specific. I have been trying to ensure that any decision you arrived at was arrived at freely, without pressure from my direction, because the particular thing I wanted was the last thing I had any right to want while you were in the circumstances you were in. And now, she said, now you're in different circumstances. Yes, she said, I am. A sound, greenwood splitting. He was quiet for a moment longer, and she watched something move across his face that she had not seen in the boardroom or the study or the corridor after the board meeting, something that was not controlled, because he had not chosen to control it. A sound like green wood splitting that had come up from underneath the management and was simply there present, the expression of a man who had been holding something carefully for a very long time and had finally been given permission to set it down. The birthday dinner, he said, when you held the smile through what Grant said. The specific way you held it, the quality of effort it required, that you were not allowing anyone to see. He paused. I left the room because I couldn't sit in it and watch it and do nothing, and the only form of nothing available to me was to remove myself from the situation before I did something that wasn't mine to do. You noticed, she said. I noticed you the way you notice things that are wrong, he said. Things that are mishandled, things that deserve better than what they're receiving. He looked at her. What I noticed has not changed in 10 months. It has become considerably more detailed, but the essential thing has not changed. She stood in the April evening on the roof above the city where she had rebuilt herself from the inside out, and she held what he had said, and she did not rush past it or minimize it or fold it into something more manageable. She let it be what it was. Then I need you to know something in return, she said. Whatever comes next between us, I am not a project. I am not a recovery. I am not the woman who needed saving and is now grateful enough to love you for it. I have done the work of becoming who I am now, and I am not going to disappear back into someone else's definition of me, regardless of how much I feel for that person. That is not negotiable. No, he said. It isn't. And it's not what I want. What do you want? She said. He reached into his jacket pocket. The ring was simple. Small diamond, clean setting, nothing that announced itself. The choice of a man who understood that the gesture's meaning came from what it represented rather than from its scale, and who had never in his life needed to compensate for substance with display. He held it in his palm between them, not presenting it, offering it, the distinction being one of power, the difference between a man bestowing and a man asking. "I am not asking you to need me," he said. "I know you don't. I am asking whether you want to build something besides someone who has known the difference between those two things from the beginning and who will continue to know it." He looked at her with the complete attention. "I am asking whether you want a life where you don't have to choose between being loved and being yourself. Because I don't believe those should be a choice." She looked at the ring in his palm. She thought about the burgundy dress and the 14 minutes at the window, and the sparkling water and the smile she had held through a room full of laughter. She thought about the Antwerp file and 11:20 at night and the decision she had made alone. She thought about the boardroom and the word continue, the steadiness she had found in herself in the moment she needed it most. She thought of Cora's kitchen and the bad coffee on the turnpike and the East River in early morning and the walk she had taken back through a city that had always been hers, even when she had forgotten to act like it. She had spent 6 years living inside someone else's version of reality. She had spent 10 months building her own. She knew what she wanted. She reached out and took the ring from his palm. She held it for a moment, not hesitating, just being present with it, letting it be real before it became the next thing. The city light caught it. It was a small thing, and it was also not small at all. She looked up at him. "Yes," she said. It came out steady. Performed, not performed. She was forming just steady. The way things are steady when they come from the right place, the honest place, the place in a person that has been doing the work long enough to know what it's earned. His hands were not entirely steady when he took the ring from her fingers and placed it on her hand, which she noticed, and would carry with her for a long time the slight tension in his grip, the breath he released when it was done, the way that even a man who had spent 40 years mastering his own composure was not entirely composed in the moment that mattered most to him. She looked at her hand. The ring sat there in the April evening against the city light, small and real, and belonging to her by choice. Around them, Manhattan continued at its constant pitch, the noise and light and movement of a city that does not pause for private moments and does not need to, that holds the private moments inside its vastness without being changed by them, which is one of the things about it that is simultaneously maddening and exactly right. Evelyn looked at the ring on her hand, and then at the man beside her, and then at the city below them, and she felt something she had not felt in so long that she almost did not recognize it. The specific, unperformed, ordinary feeling of being in the correct place. Not the place that was safe, not the place that was approved, not the place that someone else's definition of her life required her to occupy. The place she had built toward, one decision at a time, through every costly and necessary thing that had brought her here. She was going to keep her name professionally. She had decided this on the turnpike, quietly, without drama. Evelyn Marlowe was the name attached to her professional record, to the Hargrove years, and the Antwerp file, and the Rotterdam restructuring in the board meeting, and everything she had done under her own authority, and she was not going to replace it. She would be Evelyn Whitlock in the life she was building. She would be Evelyn Marlowe in the work. The distinction was not a statement, it was simply accurate, and accuracy was the thing she had committed to. Dashiell, she thought, would understand this completely. He was looking at her now, with the expression that was not the controlled version, or the professional version, but the one underneath both of those, the version that had existed since a birthday dinner, when everyone else has laughed, and he had set down his napkin and left the room, rather than be part of what the room was doing. She had been thinking about that moment for 10 months. She had been thinking about what it meant to be seen correctly by someone who had the power to look away and chose not to. "You waited 6 months," she said, not accusingly, just returning to the thing that had been sitting with her since Carver. "Yes," he said, "and then you gave me a card and waited some more." "Yes. That's a considerable amount of waiting for a man who generally moves things according to his own schedule." Something in his expression shifted, not quite the almost smile, something more interior than that, the expression of someone acknowledging an accurate observation about themselves. "You were worth the patience," he said. She looked at him. "I was worth it the whole time," she said. "That's what I've spent 10 months learning." "Yes," he said, "you were." The city hummed below them. The April air moved across the rooftop with the tentative warmth of a season that had not fully committed yet but was getting there. Somewhere on the street below, a car horn made its brief declarative statement and was absorbed into the ambient sound of 10 million people living their various lives in proximity to one another. Evelyn Marlowe stood on a rooftop in Manhattan with a ring on her hand and the specific knowledge of what she had survived and what she had built and what she had chosen freely, from strength, from the deepest and most honest part of herself. A sound she was... The greatest change in her life had not been leaving her marriage, or finding her professional footing, or standing in a boardroom with a document that cost her everything she had been holding back. The greatest change had happened somewhere in the ordinary accumulation of days in a rest stop on the turnpike, in a kitchen making coffee before dawn, in the moment she had stopped adjusting her reality to match someone else's comfort and had started simply reporting what she actually saw. The moment she had stopped apologizing for taking up space. That was where it had started. Everything else, the ring, the work, the man beside her. The city below was what happened when a woman who had stopped apologizing walked through the door that had been left open for her and discovered that she had enough in herself not just to walk through, but to decide what to build on the other side. She was building. She intended to continue.